Welcome to Getting to the Truth in This Art on MTR Podcast. I am your host, Rob Lee, and today's guest is musician, and I believe your role is like you're the president, right? You're the president of the Baltimore Jazz Alliance, Ian Rashkin. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Hey, nice to be here.
So we were talking a little bit before we got started. And Baltimore, I've realized, is small when it comes to the scenes, the different artists and creatives. And it was great to kind of maybe step outside of who I generally kind of work with and who I've generally worked with in the past. It's kind of I feel like I've interviewed 3 artists from the same group, and I was like, okay, I'm kind of just scraping the bottom right here, and reaching out and just connecting with you has been dope. And I wanted to get an idea of what your work is about, what you do to, allow the artists to kind of speak on what they do and what the mission of the BJA is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, let me start with the sort of the BJA and how I tie to it.
Sure.
So I'm not from Baltimore. I came here about 15 years ago, and I'm a bass player and a composer, and play different kinds of things. But I got here and I didn't know anybody, so I started slowly feeling my way out, trying to find where people were at for jazz and different kinds of music, and it was a little hard to find. And then I stumbled across the BJA website, BaltimoreJazz.com. And, so I was like, okay, let me check this out. And I subscribed to their newsletter. And it was at least it gave me some grounding in where to look, because that's one of the things, like you mentioned, being in your box and you sort of, interviewing the people, and there's this other. What I've found in Baltimore is there's these really cool scenes. There's a really cool jazz scene. There's a really cool punk scene. There's a really cool noise scene, yeah, or sort of experimental weird scene. But there's not it's not publicized. There's not a lot of ways to find out about it until you get into it, and then you're like, holy crap! There's a ton of stuff going on. So that's what the BJA is about, is trying to take the jazz portion of that and saying, hey, guys, come on in and join us in here, because there's a lot of really killer musicians in Baltimore. And, to me and to a lot of us, jazz is sort of like the ultimate self-expression. You can really be so free and yet so tied to history at the same time. There's just some amazing people in this town, and so we try to bring them out and bring people to them.
That's great. And that's a great mission or North Star, if you will, for it. I was one of those people that I didn't know enough about it, and I know enough about the genre, a whole genre of music. And I just remember it was something my dad played, and it was just it was like growing up as a kid. It's like, all right, this is my time when I'm ready. I'm listening to this, and him just turning on. It was WEAA. It would be
mm-hmm.
Morgan State, and they would have their. It was Gary Ellaby, and they would be playing different jazz. I'm like, and now as an adult, I'm like, all right, turn that up a little bit. What are we doing here? And that's really cool. So I want to. And actually, it's funny. The only record I own, because I'm going to start collecting vinyl, is a Charles Mingus record, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. But what would you say? Because I want to talk about you as an artist and more about the BJA as well. But how did you start playing? How did you get into playing? You said you're a bassist and a composer. How did you get into playing?
Well, I actually started out playing screaming into a microphone in punk rock bands in my teens, early teens, and I was out on the West Coast, so we used to play all the shows because we were sort of a novelty kid band, young teenagers playing all the hardcore shows, and so we got a lot of gigs, and we played with everybody out there, which was really cool, and that kind of gave me a taste for wanting to be in that, and I just never wanted to be outside of the music scene after that. But as I got in, I played some drums, I played some guitar, I played some bass, and I kind of settled on bass. And then when I heard Mingus and Jaco Pastorius and a couple other people like that, I was like, oh shit, this is where it's at. This is what I want to do. And that's why I just, focused more and more on that, and my tastes grew. And it's funny. I don't want to diverge too much from your question, I guess, but people sometimes think of, jazz as like their parents' music or whatever, and like, or it's hard to get into, or it's like sort of this either over thoughtful or maybe complicated or just boring. And I don't know, for me, coming from a punk background, it's like the next level of screaming self-expression. You can do whatever you want, and you can take things into it and tear them apart and spit them back out and work with people. It's like a communication thing. It's pretty brilliant. So I've gotten more and more hooked on that.
I think it was one of those things where, and I think a lot of people will run into that have that inclination of, this is my parents' music, or this is whatever the reputation it may be. I think for me, I'm a person who really believes in DIY and really believes in improvisation and all of that. And I was like, that's kind of what jazz is about in some ways. And it's like, have that foundation from my interpretation of it, and in a very 30,000 foot view of it. But it's just like, I value this stuff. I was like, I need to just come back to it. And I think getting that seasoning and I think traveling to New Orleans, that's my favorite place to go. I've gone there like every birthday over the last few years. Probably going to change this year, but I've gone there and I was just dipped, and I was like, oh, this is what I've been missing. And it was like, that was a definitive experience for me. Do you have a maybe definitive experience or definitive song or album that hit you and just said, yeah, this is what I want to do, and this is the direction I want to go in it?
It's always hard for me to settle on one because there's a lot of things. But, one thing that's always stuck with me, it was, I guess it was the late 80s. I was a late teenager, and I had moved to Minneapolis, and I was living in Minneapolis. And that's when I just was starting to get into playing acoustic bass and understanding jazz a little bit and really getting into it. And besides Mingus, one of my real early influences and serious idols still is Niels Henning Ørsted Pedersen, and Hop, you'll hear him referred to as. And he was a Danish bass player that played like every date with everybody in Europe. Like you hear him on a million records, from Basie to, he's just all over the map. He's all over. And then he's done a bunch of things of his own where, bass really took the forefront and he became a leader. So I do remember like this one time going to the Artist Quarter, this old bar in Minneapolis that used to be there, and seeing him play. And, it was a typical place, like smoke. You could smoke back then, of course, smokes and drinks and people talking and having a good time. And he had this trio, just bass and trumpet and drums. And, people are talking and listening. And then suddenly, like, he takes a bass solo and the whole place was like, you could hear a pin drop except for the bass. Like, people were so, I was like, yeah, like, all of these people are getting it just like I'm getting it. And that's really cool.
That sounds really cool, actually. So we mentioned Charles Mingus, what have you, and it's funny. Some of my friends describe the way that I manage like podcasting and all of that stuff is very much the way his temperament was described. And I was like, okay, I'll take that. And we have similar dimensions because I'm like 6'4" or something, like big guy, what have you. So what is one of your favorite Mingus recordings? Like, I know it's kind of like a challenge to just like categorize it as one, but what's one that kind of sticks out that you're like, yeah, that's a real good one right there? And partially I'm looking for recommendations at this point, but go on.
His classic is that's kind of his most well-known, I guess. And it really is. It was one of the things that drew me into jazz for sure. And it still holds up to me as like mind-blowing every time I listen to it. Blues and Roots is another one, really important one. that's just so free and so, full of not exactly anger, but full of energy that's really unbridled energy. And then another one that really sort of always grabbed me it's called The Great Concert of Charles Mingus. It was a series of concerts in Europe, in Scandinavia, and it was Eric Dolphy died on that tour. So it's like the last moments of Eric Dolphy playing with him. And then, like, I think there's even one date where, Dolphy wasn't there. But, it's just these, like, 20-minute song, you go on, like, rhapsodic 20-minute kind of improvisation, and it's very free, and it's just amazing.
So I'm going to be putting out recommendations. I'm like, look, I need my record player. I need everything stacked up. Like, I always I don't know what to get you, Rob. It's like, well, here's some records. Here's some suggestions right here. Because the one that I really want is Black Saint and the Sinner Lady. That's the one that was kind of my introduction.
Yeah.
And it's just like I listen to it regularly, and it's this Japanese, I think his name is like Ryo Fukai, maybe. And I just know he was a composer, and that pulled me in, and it was like a record from like the 60s. And it was that full circle moment where I kind of impressed my dad, because that's his genre. He's like, look, I'm into, and I was just playing, and he was like, hold on, what do you know about this? I was like, and we used to have this moment where, this period where we would just hang out, drink scotch, smoke cigars, and listen to jazz. That was Friday nights with my dad. It was a great time. It was a great bonding period, and it was over jazz music. Who have been some of the more influential musicians for your own development, and maybe musicians that are local that you're like, yeah, they do good stuff?
Yeah, but like I said, I'm not from here, so I already sort of, I definitely appreciate a lot of the people here, and I always have new influences, but a lot of my formative influences weren't, from this side of the country. To name a couple of the big, big names, I guess, obviously Miles Davis, humongous influence on me, John Coltrane as well. But Don Cherry is a huge influence on me, and Henry Threadgill also. If you don't know him, you should definitely check him out.
Okay.
He's a badass. And but around here, there's been definitely some great players that really inspire me all the time. Eric Kennedy is one that comes to mind. You'll see him around everybody plays with him because he's one of the best in town, and he's a drummer. He also sings very well, but he's an amazing drummer, and you'll see him on everybody's dates because he's just that good. And I've only got to play with him once or twice, but he's a great pleasure to play with, and a super nice guy, and he brings an amazing amount of musicality to the drum set, Clarence Ward, you probably have heard his name. If not, you certainly should. He's one of the biggest names in town these days. He ran, up until COVID hit us, he ran a Monday night jam session for years that was the place to be, and everybody in town knew that. Everybody in other towns knew that. If, people would come up from D.C., people, if they're passing through from New York or Philly or whatever, they're going to be there on Monday night because that's the place to be. He plays trumpet and flugelhorn and sax as well, and he's just a phenomenal talent.
Yeah, I'm looking at his Instagram right now.
Yeah, you got to follow him for sure because he's the bomb. And there's a bunch of people. There's so many good, talented musicians in this town. It's kind of unbelievable. Carl Grubbs is one of our local treasures, I would say. He's one of the old school saxophone players, and he's he's been around and he's got some real interesting, he can blow, and he sort of brings it back to the Coltrane kind of sound. And there's just a ton. There's too many to name. I don't want to discredit anybody by not mentioning it, so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, I like that. So as far as the BJA, so how has your view of, and maybe there's not even a real answer to this, but I'll at least shoot that shot. How has your view of your craft as a musician changed since you've been involved with BJA? Have you been more attentive to it? Have you taken maybe a different approach and maybe composing or something along those lines? Has there been any change since you've gone into that role and worked with BJA?
That's an interesting question for sure. As a bass player in jazz, so I also do other kinds of music, and in other kinds of music, sometimes I've been more of a leader. But in jazz, typically a bass player is more likely to be sort of in the background and supporting somebody. But maybe related to my role as, in the BJA as sort of leading, part of the scene. And definitely I don't want to suggest that the scene is in any way represented in full by the BJA. We're just one, we're just one group that tries to do what we can to help. But people know me because of that, and people know, people come out to me because of that. And because of that, I'm able to sort of lead a little bit more and sort of direct things. So I was running a jam session every Sunday up until COVID. And, people would come out because they know me from the Jazz Alliance, and then they start to get to know me and, in person. And I guess I sort of have gravitated towards trying to make it a very inclusive, draw people in because of my role in the BJA, and maybe just because of who I am. But I just want to bring people in as players, as listeners, and make sure, that the music is doing for them what it should do for them.
Yeah. So I usually have let's see, I have two more questions, and then I have some Baltimore-oriented questions, which I hear intimidate people. And you've been here. You said that you're not from here, but you've been here for a decade and a half. So you're not new. You're not a newbie. So in terms of in your experience as a musician, and with all the other things, you have a long resume. Because I believe I read that you're a software guy. So
yeah, that's day job. So, I gave up. I went to music school, University of Washington, for classical bass, actually, and composition. And I still do both of those things as well. But I was playing jazz throughout and playing experimental music throughout. And for a while, I kind of tried to make my living play. I was like, okay, I want to make my living being a bass player. But the reality was I was playing a lot of gigs that I didn't enjoy. Right. And barely making ends meet, and never having time to do music that I wanted. So I was like, I got to find a better way to support myself, and slowly worked my way into the software development field, which is great. It's enjoyable enough, and it puts food on the table, and it lets me focus my creative energy on just what I care about. So when I go out and play, it's because I want to and because I enjoy it, and it's not because I'm trying to pay rent.
I had to learn a similar thing where I've been, and I say this on every podcast, but I've been podcasting for about 12 years. And it's one of those things where I realized it was something I enjoy doing, and I take it serious. This is, it may sound super pretentious or what have you, but I look at this as my art, my creative outlet, and I approach it as such. So any job that I do is I enjoy this enough that it's going to fund that creative endeavor, keep a roof over my head and food on the plate, and be able to kind of do things that I want. There have been other opportunities where, hey, you got a good voice. You should be on a radio show. Or you should be on a podcast. It's like, and it's someone else's. It's, money being exchanged. And it's just like, your podcast sucks or your radio show sucks. I don't want to do this. I'd rather just have that creative control and that ability to, if I want to talk about the movie Predator for 30 minutes on a podcast, I can, and it'll be fine.
Right.
So let's see. I guess as in your perspective, what piece of advice has been the most helpful for you, and maybe a piece of advice that you would share to someone who wants to maybe delve a bit deeper into being a musician, or even like venturing into more experimental music? Because we didn't even really touch on the experimental music piece of it, but what advice would you give for someone that may be interested in broadening their palette when it comes to music, or maybe a piece of advice you got when you started out as a musician?
Can I give you two things?
Sure. Two is good.
is a piece of advice that I'd heard, but I didn't really follow, and I can say more in hindsight, like it would have been good to follow, and it's advice that I give to people now. So there was, back in Seattle, I used to play with a guy named Evan Kang. He's a violinist, composer, and pretty hard. He's kind of like when I say violinist, you're not picturing it, but break the strings and smashing glass and, pretty crazy shit. So he came, he wasn't from Seattle. He was from Iceland. He had come to go to Corners College of the Arts there. And he had this idea. I don't know if you know John Zorn. John Zorn's one of the big big names in avant-garde jazz-ish music. Yeah. And he had this idea that he wanted to play with John Zorn. Like that's kind of the direction he was heading, right? And that's, especially back then. This is 25, 30 years ago now. It was pretty lofty and esoteric. But his advice was, take every gig. Just go out there and take every opportunity and don't stop until you get where you want. And he did. He took every opportunity. He did everything he could. He played all the time. He didn't make any money. But within a few years, he was in New York playing with John Zorn, Bill Frisell, all these cats all over the world doing exactly what he wanted. And, so I take that to heart, and I tell people, if you want to get there, take every gig, you play with every person that asks you, whether it pays or not, because those are all connections and they're all experience, and they're all going to get you a little bit further on your way. The other thing is from my composition teacher, Kenneth Benshoff. And this really applies in composing, like written music, but it also applies in jazz, in every kind of, in hip hop, in everything. And it's something I listened for. And one of the most memorable things I got from him was, if you think about music as like a building, and like, okay, this melody, this A section is the wall here, and this B section is the wall there. Right? There's these different sort of sections, and they might look different and they might feel different. But the corners are the important parts. Like, you can make the wall as beautiful as you want, but if you fuck up the corner, like, nobody's going with you. Yeah. You've got to pay attention to the corners, and that's always stuck with me. Like, don't screw up those transitions. You've got to make it right. It doesn't have to be smooth. Maybe you want it to be rough, but be intentional. Make sure it's what you want it to be.
That makes a lot of sense. I think both pieces make a lot of sense. The first piece, definitely it clicks for me. It clicks for me. And the second piece, I think in kind of chewing on it a bit, absolutely. It makes a lot of sense, because you hear something that's just kind of off, and it's like, nah, you try harder on that one. Do a little bit more work there. Something's out of sync there. So in the last few questions I had, these are the Baltimore questions. And outside of that, I give you opportunity to shamelessly plug anything that you want to plug. And this has been a treat for me. It's always good, like, talking to someone that's just, they know what they're talking about. That's what I'm hearing. So let's see. You don't have a seafood issue, do you? You don't have a seafood allergy, do you, or anything like that?
No, although I don't really eat seafood.
Okay. Because I was going to ask the question of like, where's the best crab cake at? Yeah, that's the thing.
I've never eaten a crab in my life, and I don't.
Really? Huh. Offensive. Slightly offensive. Okay. Then I'll ask this one then. If so, these would be the two then. What area in Baltimore City do you maybe get the most like inspiration from? Like what areas like, yeah, this has like really good design in the buildings here, or that's some cool graffiti there or something along those lines. What kind of gives you some of that creative juice and just being there? Because everybody has their different areas. Like I'll go down to Station North and I just feel like I need to pull out the pen and the pad and write something down, an observation or something. What would that area be for you?
I guess it kind of depends. Like I associate areas more with the things that I do there.
Sure.
And the most, I don't know. I used to, I guess I spend more time in West Baltimore than anywhere else. And I don't spend a ton of time in West Baltimore. But other than my own neighborhood, actually, which is like the Pimlico neighborhood, and I like that. But when I used to work in Catonsville, I used to drive home from work most days up, what's it called, Fulton, and then up Park Heights. So this long, long road of row houses, and I don't know, man. That neighborhood does always inspire me a little bit, I have to say. And then I've spent a lot of time with, more related to jazz in the Pennsylvania corridor that sort of intersects that. And I think of all the places, you've got things like the Arch Social Club down there, and you've got the Avenue Bakery, and my friend Todd's place, Jubilee Arts down there. And there's all these kind of really interesting things going on, and it's kind of like it's where the jazz scene used to be, and it isn't anymore, but it's sort of the historic strip, and that it still gives me this cool vibe that I really enjoy. It does.
That's good. That's good. It's good to check those areas out, because it's just something there. You walk through an area and you're like, yeah, okay, people are creative. It's almost like how if I go to an environment where I feel like people are learning, it kind of pushes me inherently to like, I need to pick up a new skill. That's how I look at it. And it's just like an aura or a vibe, or just like a creative energy that's just there. And it sounds very metaphysical, what have you, but it's just there and it hits me. And I think everybody has their place. And the last question I have for you would be, if someone's like chatting with you and they're saying they're coming into Baltimore for a long weekend, this is post-COVID or non-COVID. What are 3 things that you think they should do? If they come here for a long weekend, they've never been here before, what would you say? You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this.
I would say you have to go to the session on Monday night. I do say that. Everybody who comes in, again, like not during COVID, but normally, and it's moved from a venue to venue over the years, but it's always been Monday night at some venue. And I bring everybody that. And everybody I know brings everybody to that. Like, if you're in town, you definitely got to go to that session. And so that's number 1. Number 2 might be a little weird, but for me, the BMA, but specifically the Andy Warhol's Last Supper, which, they just had this whole to-do about they were going to sell it, and then they backed down. I'm really glad they did. Because to me, I don't know why, something about that piece, I go in there and this huge expanse really gets me. And I always try to take people there. And then I think the third thing would be Leakin Park and the trail sculptures and the ice house and all the kind of weird stuff that's hidden in the woods there. Not the bodies so much, but there's all this other kind of. It's a really cool park, and it's got just the idea that like there's this prayer circle, stone circle maze thing, and then there's all these sculptures, and then it's like people have come together and put all these different energies into that park. I always enjoy it.
Well, that's great. Well, one, thank you for sharing that, because it sounds just like different areas, and it's a very kind of encapsulating like vibe of what Baltimore has to offer in terms of culture and in that art scene. So that's probably the best answer I've gotten to that question. It's not like, hey, you got to get fried chicken from here, you got to go here, have a drink. It's like, no, take in culture. You can get all of this anywhere.
Yeah.
So I thank you for that. And I thank you for coming on to the show. So do you have anything that you want to plug, social media, BJA's site, any of that?
Yeah, definitely BaltimoreJazz.com. That will lead you to everything else Baltimore Jazz related. But, we're out there just to help people connect with the great jazz scene. And we have a newsletter, we have articles on the website, we have a calendar of all the jazz. Even now during COVID, there's live jazz going on, and there's live streamed jazz going on. And we try to keep our calendar up to date. We send a email blast and a social media blast out. And you can get hooked up with all that. We have our Facebook group and our Facebook page and our Twitter and Instagram and all that. You can get hooked up with all that at BaltimoreJazz.com.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. This has been a real treat for me. So I'll do my sign off. So for Ian Rashkin, I'm Rob Lee saying that there's art and jazz in and around Baltimore. You just have to look for it.